Hello and welcome. I am Brian Bender, Senior National Correspondent at Politico, and I am thrilled to be here today moderating what I think is going to be a great panel discussion on security, competition, and cooperation in the Asia Pacific. We have a terrific group of panelists here. I'd like to get right to introducing them. First up, we have Dr. Wahaguru Paul Sidhu, who is a professor at New York University. We also have Dr. Ahmed Al-Mahamadi, who is Associate Fellow of the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. We also have Ms. Maya Mirchandani, a Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Also following her, Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, who is a Senior Fellow and Head of the Center of Excellence for National Security at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And lastly, last but not least, Dr. Asfandyar Mir Affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. So we truly have a global group of experts here to engage in this discussion. And I want to start off, a lot of the discussion these days, when we talk about the Asia Pacific, of course, is the rise of China and how countries in the region, how the United States and its allies in the region are responding to China's activities. But China does not present the only security issue in the region. There are a lot of others, and one of them, of course, is terrorism and global groups that are of a concern for countries in the region, but also concern for countries outside the region who worry that these groups might have designs in terms of launching attacks elsewhere. And so I'd like to begin the conversation by going around the region and in some ways doing an anatomy of sorts. When we're talking about global terrorism in the Asia Pacific, what exactly are we talking about? Who are we talking about? What groups? What are their aims? What are their goals? What is driving these groups to pose the threat that they pose? So maybe we'll begin first. If it's okay, Shashi, maybe we'll start with you. But if you look at the Asia Pacific region and think about the terrorist threat, take us on a little bit of a tour. What do you see as the most aggressive, most organized terrorist groups in the region? And then maybe we can get some of the other panelists to weigh in as well on that question.
Sure, Brian. Thanks very much. I'm honored to have the opportunity to be here. For any analyst who looks at these issues, terrorism, extremism in Southeast Asia, and I'm doing so in a think tank capacity now. I formerly looked at these issues when I was in Singapore government. So I think I've seen both sides of the story to some degree. The story for many of us began with the 9/11 attacks, because very quickly you've got the Al-Qaeda affiliate in this part of the world, which is the JI, the Jamaat Islamiyah, planning, fomenting, and indeed in some cases successfully carrying out attacks in this part of the world. And this includes the Bali 1 bombings, but that's October 2002. There are subsequent successful bombings by JI and the more violent parts of the JI offshoots, particularly in Indonesia. They tried in Singapore, they came very close. In fact, in 2001, and there was a series of interdictions, arrests by the Singapore authorities, and they're put through a rehab process. We can come to that in a second. But that's Singapore and Indonesia. And of course, Ahmad here is going to deal, I'm sure, very capably with the Malaysian situation. I'm not going to touch on that. But I did want to point out that even though groups remain active and present in Southeast Asia 20 years later, and this includes Jamaat Islamiyah, there are a few others, even though groups are still there, at least in Singapore and for some of the rest of the region, from the mid part of the 2000s decade, you start to have self-radicalized individuals who in some ways are equally dangerous, even though they're not necessarily tied to any one terrorist group. So when the first self-radicalized Singaporean, not tied to a group, was detained, his name was Bashir, lawyer, successful, went to the best school in Singapore called Raffles, which incidentally I went to as well. I did not know him, by the way. this is a sea change in thinking, which is necessitated on the part of security practitioners and think tankers as well, because it's quite shocking that you've got people who are highly committed, potentially very, very dangerous. In Singapore, you've all done national service, military service, if you're male, obviously. And you start to see that in other parts of Southeast Asia as well. And then, of course, there's a noticeable pickup in the years leading up to and after the declaration of the caliphate by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, June 2014. There was a trickle to Syria and the Middle East before, but from that point on, you've got people who arguably are self-radicalized, but take on the cloak or mantle of ISIS. And from Singapore, a small number actually went to Syria, Iraq. They're mostly thought to have been killed. From Indonesia, hundreds. And of course, you have to include the families for the Indonesians as well. And for Malaysia, I'll let Ahmad talk about this, but also in the hundreds, but I believe slightly less than the Indonesian number. So the clarion call, I think, must be to look at three different disparate issues. One is the remnants of the old groups, including JI. Second is self-radicalized individuals. Third is the blowback of fighters who would find it, I think, very, very difficult to come back to the region, Southeast Asian fighters and their families, but some have, in particular from Indonesia, where it's possible to attempt to slip back into your country almost as if nothing ever happened. I believe this may have been the case for other parts of Southeast Asia, including maybe Malaysia, but I will stand to be corrected by the expert here who knows better. In Singapore, this has not been tried yet, but the numbers are so small and most of them are thought to have been killed. I'm going to pause here. There's obviously a lot more to be said about what happened in Marawi, the Philippines, and new manifestations. There are some signs that right-wing extremism is seeping into Southeast Asia, but I'm sure we can come to that. We'll have an opportunity to talk about these things later. So that's where we are in my view. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Well, queuing off of that, Maya, give us your perspective on what you see as some of the most virulent, well-organized groups. Some of these we obviously have been familiar with for a long time. It sounds like, from what Shashi is saying, the ones to be most concerned about are global in nature. In other words, they're not localized groups with localized or simply localized ambitions. They have much bigger global ambitions or certainly regional ambitions. Would you agree with that? That the texture of these groups, the most concerning groups, are groups that have a much larger agenda, quite frankly, than just in the location where they're located?
Brian, thanks very much for asking that question, and thank you to the Soufan Center for having me on this panel with so many illustrious scholars. The fact is that I think from where I'm sitting in New Delhi, the picture on extremism and extremist actors is actually far more complicated and layered than just the narrative of a global jihadi consortium, if you will, of actors who've been working from West Asia all the way to Southeast Asia in this part of the world. I think for India, really, or from India at least, the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan has created a set of circumstances that is really sort of Pandora's box. And I say this because we know about the Taliban and its sort of history of fundamentalist ideologies and violence, and also its support for Al-Qaeda in the past. Now we have a situation where if there are groups like ISKP operating in Afghanistan and they are at odds with the Taliban, the question then becomes who is supporting them, controlling them, responsible for them, and what is going to be the nature of their spread, the IS's spread from Afghanistan into the rest of South Asia and the subcontinent. We've already seen activity like the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka, for example. India has seen somewhat of an uptick in, the exposure of terror cells that might be sort of leaning towards the Islamist State. The national investigation agencies pursuing some of those leads. But because of the nature of what New Delhi calls cross-border terrorism as well. The interlinkages between the IS, between other non-state actors in Afghanistan, the Taliban, groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and their like-minded compatriots, if you will, in the rest of Southeast Asia, really continue to pose one of the biggest security threats from the jihadi terror perspective in India. And that's an ongoing pattern. I mean, India, to give it credit where it's due, I mean, if you look at the nature of IS recruitment and radicalization across the globe, India stands out as what I think George Washington University called a circuit breaker, which is that it was one part of the subcontinent where you actually did not see the kind of numbers, the kind of people involved with the global jihad as you saw from other neighboring countries in the region as well. And that's something that India prides itself on. For the security state right now, the question really is, can Delhi manage to keep those pressures at bay because of the fallout of different conversations on the security front that have emerged in the last few months? That's obviously one part of the story. And, India-Pakistan rivalry is, of course, a whole different part of this conversation, and we can get to some of that later if you like. But a bigger question for people like me who are looking at countering violent extremism or de-radicalization or the drivers of radicalization in my part of the world is how they are being fed and fueled by what is being mirrored on the right. And when I say right, I mean religious, ethnic, identity-based extremist actors who kind of fuel this notion of all Muslims as jihadis, if you will, all Muslims as terrorists. And that's a narrative which has crept into our political conversations in this part of the world. Whether you look at it from the perspective of relations between Bangladesh and India and the illegal immigrant or the Rohingya refugee who is being radicalized in refugee camps, who is going to, place violent fundamentalist ideology over livelihood, and therefore becomes a threat to India. This is rhetoric, and these are narratives that is fueled by a growing right wing. And the one thing that people like me are talking about is sort of, in a sense, tactical similarities between what is now globally perceived of as right-wing extremism, which is white supremacist extremism in the globe, and these smaller groups and actors which are amorphous, which engage on the basis of identity and identities under threat by the other, by the immigrant, by the Muslim, by whoever have you, and try and create a collective of propaganda and opinion online that's fueling the cycle of violence. So even Indian Muslims who have therefore prided themselves and sort of people who work with Indian Muslim communities on issues of de-radicalization, who have prided themselves on being the circuit breaker, are now saying that we're in a situation where everybody is radicalizing all the time, and different kinds of radicalizing forces are ending up having an impact on the other side of the extremist divide. So if anti-Muslim rhetoric from the Hindu right wing reaches, a crescendo, you see a reaction, or you could see a reaction from the other side. And that really is something that is a serious threat right now. And just to sort of conclude before I open up to other speakers, I mean, regional collaboration on counter-terrorism in this part of the world is tricky for the simple reason that states fundamentally don't trust each other. And that goes back to a South Asian rivalry as well. China has its own interests. Pakistan has its own interests vis-a-vis Kashmir. Bangladesh is feeling alienated in this conversation. Sri Lanka has its own approach towards its ethnic violent actors, as well as Sri Lankan Muslims right now. So there is a fundamental layer of, who can engage together and who can you talk to. And I think that's really, to me, in the post withdrawal scenario when there are no sort of US troops that have been seen as a stabilizing force in Afghanistan, keeping some of these forces at bay. It's a wide open space. I mean, who's going to fill it? Who's going to fill in the counterterrorism work? Who is going to do the radicalizing? I mean, these are all really open questions right now.
Well, that's an interesting point. I want to get back to that because I feel like the vacuum, as you put it, in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, does raise the question of who is going to lead this fight, and how do you cobble together all of these countries with very different perspectives, and in many respects, different groups that they're dealing with to try and come together with some sort of comprehensive plan. But to stick with Afghanistan for a moment, Sidhu, maybe you can take a crack at this one. How much has the situation in Afghanistan, in your view, changed the landscape here when we're talking about global terror groups? If you listen to Maya, you get the impression that, more than the impression, that when we talk about terrorist groups in the Asia Pacific, we're talking about a pretty wide field of groups. Obviously, many of them Muslim extremists, but not all of them. Presumably driven by a variety of different factors. Grievances are not all the same. And so I'm curious, how much does the Afghanistan situation truly impact the rest of this picture? Does it fuel it? Does it, or is it more like Maya said? It's just more the reshaping of the war there and the role of the United States there opens up sort of a new era that looks unclear at this point.
Brian, thank you again for having me on this panel. Delighted to be here, and for your question. I want to start with actually the question that you posed initially to Maya on the question of global versus local, right? And I think it's really you put your finger on it, because if you look at it, the global always takes precedence over the local. And sitting where I am in New York, if you look at what the UN has done, the very first direct resolutions related to terrorism, were actually 1273 and 1367. One before 9/11 and the other after 9/11, both focused very precisely on Afghanistan. And so really kind of underlining that, only groups which are likely to have a global impact are ones that are going to be of number one sort of precedence. The only other resolution which deals with the kind of a terrorist group in another part of the world is actually Mali. But nowhere else has there been that kind of a focus on it. So just to underline the question you asked, Afghanistan has been central, absolutely, even pre 9/11, but definitely post 9/11 as well. And what happens there is going to have ramifications and repercussions, both in terms of, the radicalization of one particular community, which we've been talking about, but also the counter-radicalization. So, for example, nobody's mentioned so far the white supremacist attacks in New Zealand. Are a manifestation in some ways, and again, I would add Australia to that as well, of that kind of a reaction and response. Shashi laid out, I think, very well, the broad scope of it, but there's a couple of things that we might want to add to that, and which again, Afghanistan becomes central. Number one, we need to be very concerned about ungoverned spaces or contested spaces. And Afghanistan is a very good example of that, even under the Taliban today. The fact that they're not able to manage ISIS Khorasan is indication of that. And then, of course, you have that whole ungoverned belt between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where it's really, the wild, wild east. So that's another element as well. But added to this mix, another area that we haven't talked about is the linkages with organized crime. So the fact that Afghanistan was also the center of the heroin trade, opium production in the world, and you can look at that right across the Indo-Pacific. All of the other groups that you're talking about also have those kind of linkages as well. This is a very, and I apologize for that, a very long way of coming to your question of, what does the withdrawal of the US mean from Afghanistan mean? Well, it basically means it's not so much that, there's an issue with the US withdrawal, but really the way that it's happened. It's almost in many ways worse than the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan because nobody had any expectations when the Soviets withdrew. But when the US withdrew, there were great expectations that there would actually be some kind of an arrangement or structure to manage the kind of global terrorist challenges that Afghanistan faced. And is going to basically present to the rest of the world. And frankly, that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at the global level. It doesn't exist at the regional level. And it definitely doesn't exist at the domestic level.
Interesting. Asfandia, respond to the question, if you can, of how central Afghanistan is. It's not the only ungoverned or contested space in the Asia Pacific, by any means. But do you agree that it's still sort of the beating heart, if you will, of the global jihadist movement, and that what happens there will portend to what happens elsewhere? And then maybe you can also address, in addition to how important Afghanistan is going forward, a little bit of the connections here. In other words, you hear about global jihadi groups. Oftentimes one group is described as an offshoot of this group. Give us a sense of how connected in the year 2021 are these groups? Are they truly connected, or are they loosely connected, like-minded, but not really working together? I think there's a lot of misconception here about how organized this global movement really is versus maybe how it isn't.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Superman Center, and really delighted to be a part of this distinguished panel. So I agree with the sentiment that Afghanistan remains at the heart of the global jihadist movement. And I want to go back a few months from now, when President Biden came into office and he had this big Afghanistan decision. And President Biden's position for the last decade or so had been that the US government should not be pursuing a state-building strategy in Afghanistan, that it was a lost cause, and that the only interest the US government should really look out for in Afghanistan was terrorism. And so very quickly, his decision to stay on or leave from Afghanistan came down to an assessment of the terror landscape in Afghanistan. And so at the time of his decision, he argued, or you could say the US government in general argued, that the terror threat from Afghanistan was both low and manageable for the foreseeable future. And at least the United States could afford to be indifferent to whatever this residual threat in the country was. This was the position. I would say this is the received wisdom in parts of the U.S. national security community, which has been used to mount this pivot towards great power competition and politics away from counterterrorism. That this, I think people make the argument that that's a fight of the past, and we need to look towards challenges of the future. As much as I agree that there are these new challenges of the future, the administration's assessment of the terror threat was deeply flawed. And I think with the Taliban's return to power, that view, or that the fact that the administration's assessment had a problem is being demonstrated. Afghanistan has a dynamic landscape. It's dotted by a significant presence of actors we've all known about. Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda still remains in the country. The chief of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, has been in Afghanistan for the last few years, as per most indicators. available. Al-Qaeda also has some local units, more regionally focused units geared towards South Asia, interested in operations in both Pakistan and India, and I would say, a little bit beyond India as well, in say parts of Bangladesh, perhaps other parts of Southeast Asia as well. Then there's the Islamic State. The Islamic State Khorasan has been mentioned. It is connected to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. There are indicators, as recent as 2020, of the Islamic State in Khorasan receiving funding, some type of political direction from its from the central node of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Then there's some localized or more regionally oriented jihadis in the country, like the anti-Pakistan jihadi faction, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, based in eastern Afghanistan. It's really stepped up its campaign of violence. And then there's a whole alphabet soup of Central Asian jihadis in parts of northern Afghanistan, eastern Afghanistan, threatening Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, for instance. Then there's some anti-India jihadis as well. For the most part, they've supported the insurgency of the Taliban over the last few years, but they certainly have ambitions to mount operations in India. And finally, some anti-China jihadis, Uyghur jihadis, part of the Turkestan Islamic Party. That's a specific group, and that group remains interested in operations in targeting China outside of Afghanistan. So it's a very dynamic landscape. The trouble is that the U.S. withdrawal is more than a withdrawal. It is a political signal. It is extremely consequential for the jihadist movement, because they're able to now make the case that powerful states can be defeated. That's that's the dominant narrative right now. If you follow jihadi chatter, if you follow jihadist narratives, and the U.S. withdrawal has substantially bolstered the morale and strength of a number of groups. And the final major concern I have is that the one big thing which has kept a lid on some of these terrorist threats over the last few years has been state capacity bolstered by bilateral, multilateral cooperation. And the U.S. has really taken a lead on that. The U.S. has undersigned this international counterterrorism regime, which has had its flaws, but it has also had some real. It has offered some real dividends to partner nations, but not that the U.S. is less interested and less able to lead this fight on counterterrorism. I think we're going to see bilateral and multilateral cooperation suffer. So overall, I'd say that 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, the terror threat from Afghanistan continues to define the global extremist jihadist landscape, at least, and the threat endures, not just for the U.S. but for the rest of the world.
Well, Ahmad, I'm anxious to go to you, both on this question of the central role of Afghanistan, but I also think it's important, and Asfandia brought this up, also talk about the role of Pakistan. We obviously can't talk about what will happen in Afghanistan without also talking about how Pakistan will shape that or impact that. So first up, Afghanistan, is it central? I'm presuming you agree, but maybe you don't agree. But beyond just how central Afghanistan has been, how concerned are you, as some of the others are, that without the U.S. there, it becomes much more dangerous and even a bigger source of instability?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thank you very much as well to Sufan for inviting me to share my thought on this. It's a great honor to be among the panelists here. I would like to mention 3 points here. First, we are in Malaysia. We always look at the threat, the terrorism threat, radicalization, as the glorical phenomenon. Glorical, what I mean by glorical is the locally created and regionally connected and globally inspired. So there are always these 3 connections between local, regional, as well as the international or systemic level or factors. So these are the way we look at the events, the terrorism threat. Dr. Shashi mentioned about the threat of Jamaat Islamiyah, for example, an ISIS affiliates group in the region, which is actually connected to the group here as well in Malaysia, in Indonesia, as well as in the Philippines, and some of them having, reside in Singapore. They shared this common ideology. So that is the first point. The second point I would like to mention is about the globalization and the spillover effect. If we look at history in the past, let's say we talk about Afghanistan in the first Soviet Afghan War, 79, 89, for example, we have seen that what has going on in the Central Asia, in Afghanistan, has certain implication to the people in the Southeast Asia. Many people from this region traveled to that part of the world to join the war. From Malaysia, from Indonesia, well, from the Philippines, they went over there and came back to the region and created the groups. For example, Jamaat Islamiyah is one of the example. And actually, we talk about Malaysia. We also have other 2-3 other groups. For example, Kumpulan Mujahidin Malaysia and Darul Islam group. So they shared similar ideology, and they have this. I call this globally inspired ideology. So these are the things that we cannot ignore. And now third point that I would like to mention is about what's going on in Afghanistan right now. I mean, so when United States pull out its army from Afghanistan and leave the situation open, vacuum, the very big space, and so on. As you can see right now, there is a presence of ISIS-K, Al-Qaeda. So the idea, the memories, the trauma came back. What's going to happen to this region? So if you look at the responses and reaction in the region after the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, I can say that there are 5 responses, there are 5 narratives that we can identify. The first narrative is the congratulating Taliban for liberating themselves from the occupation forces. So we have people congratulate, and I think that majority of people in Malaysia here feel so happy that Afghan was finally relieved, and the United States left Afghanistan, and they are in the hands of the Afghan people. I think that was the first narrative that I can identify based on the responses. It's very interesting, including the ruling party here in Malaysia. One of the political party in Malaysia congratulate Taliban because of that. The second response that I can observe here in the region is I call this pro-Taliban total. I mean, in the region, not only in Malaysia, but I don't see this group present in Malaysia, but in Indonesia, there are certain group that is fully giving support to Taliban's takeover. Well, maybe to some people, they cannot differentiate between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Well, they would say, okay, it's a sign that whenever Taliban take over, then Al-Qaeda will operate in there. So that is the second narrative. The third narrative is anti-Taliban. There would be a group that is, I would say, over-dramatize the threat of Taliban in the region, saying that we are going to be in trouble if we look at the situation in Afghanistan, and we are going to have the upsurge of the global terrorism, including in the region. So yes, I would agree that there would be some implication. However, we also need to remember that Taliban is, they have to respect the Doha Agreement, that they cannot allow the Al-Qaeda and any other organization to operate within Afghanistan. I think these are another imperative we have to consider. And now, narrative number 4 is there are also some group among the jihadi group, among the militant group, they are suspicious of Taliban because now Taliban has betrayed the struggle. So this is also another interesting thing. For example, ISIS-K, they do not recognize Taliban, and there's certain ISIS affiliates group in the region, in the Southeast Asian region, including in Indonesia. They say that Taliban has betrayed the struggle because they have shaken hands with the United States. So they cannot accept that. because they cooperate with the United States. So that is number 4. Now we come to number 5. Number 5 is, I would say this is the official stance of the Malaysian government, that is cautious optimism, that they recognize, okay, Taliban now become the government of Afghanistan, but they cautiously observe the behavior of the government, the current government of Afghanistan today, and they do not immediately recognize. There are some voices inside the country saying that we need to recognize Taliban, but the government decided not to do so because they still have the experience of seeing Taliban has done certain things before in the first version of Taliban. So, you know, in Malaysia here, we have Taliban version 1.0, now Taliban 2.0. So that was the term, or, you know, the term used for the current Taliban that we have today. So they observe the behavior of Taliban by engaging with them unofficially, not to recognize Taliban officially, but to send out representative from here to find out what's going on in there. So I think this cautious optimism tells us something. That is, even though we recognize that Taliban has made an agreement with the United States, because there is no choice that we can do, that we have to admit that Taliban is an effective power on the ground, but cautiously, we also need to know that Taliban is a certain organization that has certain history. Thank you.
Interesting. You know, I'm curious, something that's popped into my head as I'm listening to all of you talk is that the reference to how so many jihadists from across the region flocked to Afghanistan to fight there, because that was seen as sort of the big stand after 9/11, when the United States and other countries first went in there to topple the Taliban. I'm curious just to sort of look at this from a different perspective. Now that the US military is gone and this 20-year military effort has wound down, I'm curious if there's some benefit to that, in the sense that there isn't a central fight now that's kind of a magnet for some of these fighters to go to. And number one, is that a positive potential development? But number two, does that also mean that they're going to look for some other place to take the fight, particularly if they have global ambitions and, you know, want to use an ungoverned space to plot attacks, for example, against other countries? Shashi, maybe you can tackle that. I mean, we in America used to hear a lot, we're fighting them over there so we don't have to fight them here. And, you know, that was the rationale, quite frankly, for the Iraq War, or at least some of the justification that, yes, we sort of opened a hornet's nest and we perhaps created more terrorists, but it was also a place that attracted a lot of bad actors that might otherwise plan attacks elsewhere in the world, and you know, our military can take care of them there. I'm curious, what is the potential impact of not having a central fight to go to?
Thanks very much, Brian. For those states and also individuals in Southeast Asia, individuals like me who only wish the United States well, what happened and the manner of what happened was quite shattering, maybe for many in the United States, but also for us who are friends or consider ourselves friendly. But that's a slightly different issue. To your point, you will forgive a historical observation, because I started as a historian by training. What happens when you have vacuums in that part of the world? So with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, you had the Mujahideen, obviously, and you had various peoples from various parts of the world flocking there to fight. And it should not be forgotten that there were numbers of Southeast Asians. And this is 30, 40 years ago. The numbers I have, and some of them are still around, and they're mentors to the next generation, particularly in Indonesia. But the numbers I have are probably in excess of 500 in the 80s, maybe less than 1,000. Of course, the difference with the ISIS hijra is ISIS people went with their families. It was a little bit different in the 1980s. But the point is that these people came back, particularly the Indonesians, maybe a few Malaysians, I'm not sure, and formed, incubated, or linked up with all the movements which were existing in Southeast Asia. Darul Islam is one. But the genesis of this incubation is JI, which, as I mentioned, is responsible for many atrocities, including the Bali bombings. But my point is this. Even after the Soviets left, many were still going up to Afghanistan and adjacencies, including Pakistan, where they formed small cells, and they came back and they did bad things. So the entire incubatory period is decades in the making. You already have some small signs now as we speak, or in recent months, that various individuals, and I stress small numbers, have gone up or attempted to go up to Afghanistan, some direct from Indonesia, some perhaps having been cast adrift from other struggles, other conflicts. And I believe, I will stand to be corrected, even a couple of Malaysians as well. Singapore is possible, but there's no news yet. So the point is, if you look at the history, and if you look at what's actually going on in the think tank and security establishment, I suspect, attention spans can be pretty short sometimes. And at least from what I see, certainly in the research circuit, many of us are thinking, well, ISIS, game over since roughly 2017, 2018. Afghanistan is a great shame, but let's have time to move on to the next major security challenge, which may well be, let's say, cyber disinformation, hybrid threats, that sort of thing. And people are repurposing themselves. And that's a great pity, because what's happening in Afghanistan, if you look back from a historical lens, a historical perspective, shows us more than anything else, we have to be prepared to stay the course. Because if you take a leaf from the previous incubation I just sketched out, which was decades in the making, we're going to have the blowback, I think very likely in Southeast Asia from what's happening now in Afghanistan, but we're not going to have it now. We may well have it in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but it is going to come back to roost.
Well, Maya, you brought this up earlier. Maybe this is a good way to pivot towards the question of how to fill the vacuum that all of you seem to agree is now widened in Afghanistan with the U.S. not there. It sounds like there really isn't anyone stepping up, whether it's another country or international institution, try and prevent what Shashi is talking about, that blowback, that spillover, whether it's this year, next year, or a couple of years down the road. What do you think is the prospect for some new form of cooperation that replaces perhaps the construct that existed when the U.S. was playing the lead in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Perhaps it's time for other countries to stand up, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think, they don't call it the graveyard of empires for nothing, I think, in Afghanistan. And we've seen what's happened with the Americans. Before that, it was the Soviets. I mean, I think from where I sit, certainly, it sort of defied logic that while the Biden administration had made the assessment, they were not into state building, but the importance was to ensure that the security threat was contained, while a small force or a presence was not found something that to be something that they would persist with. And what kind of openings has that led to? Look, the natural sort of the countries who are finding their natural fit into Afghanistan right now and finding their way back, you see that the Chinese are engaging cautiously, the Russians are engaging cautiously, the Iranians are engaging cautiously. India is out at the moment. The Pakistanis are engaging, we assume cautiously, but we don't know much. The point is that there is. The only way forward seems to be some sort of a collaborative or consortium-based approach, because either then we say, if the Americans have gone all right in the Great Power conflict that America sees itself in with the Chinese, for example, today, how does that play out in Afghanistan? Are the Chinese going to come in a much stronger way? I don't think the Chinese are necessarily interested in state building either. They want to ensure that their control over Afghanistan is limited to ensuring the Wakhan corridor stays peaceful. Groups like ETIM are held in check by the Taliban. That Afghanistan continues to be the trade corridor they envisage it to be for the BRI. For countries like India, who have our own conflicts with China on the Eastern front, I think really it is about waiting to see who's going to come in and step up. The Russians seem hesitant, but not to the point of saying we're not going to do anything. So I don't have an answer to your question, the truth is, Brian, because I can tell you that India is not willing to play that role. We've seen enough evidence of that. For a host of other reasons. Could a global multilateral consortium work? We had a version of ISAF. I don't know, an ISAF 2.0 or some with different countries involved. Blue berets keeping the peace over there. It's a free-for-all. We come back to the same thing. It is a free-for-all. And the concern is, as time passes, it's been now, I think, almost a month and a half since we've seen what happened in Afghanistan unfold before the end of August. We're not seeing much movement from the international community that's sort of coming out and saying, all right, we'll do this and we'll do that, apart from noises that were made in the UN during UNGA week. That's it. Right. I don't know. I don't have an answer to your question.
I think for the last quarter of our conversation, I'd like to get to the rest of the panelists on this question. And maybe we can do sort of a quicker round here and hear from all of you on what would you propose that consortium international construct look like? Are there models for this? You mentioned ISAF. As one potential model. But Sidhu, what do you think is the organization or the collection of countries that could fill the vacuum, and how would that come together? Would it be the UN? Would it be some other venue?
Definitely not the UN, and forget any notion of blue berets getting in there at all, because frankly, there isn't a mandate, and I don't think you're going to get troop contributing countries wanting to go in there. And the reason is very simple: that no country in the world or no group of countries has shown that it can function in Afghanistan effectively militarily without the United States. So one of the lessons out of Afghanistan is the absolutely embarrassing scramble of all the other ISAF partners, to get out of Afghanistan, even before the US did, and certainly after the US did. And these are all some of the greatest military powers in the world. So from that point of view, the fact that the Afghan army or military collapsed should come as no surprise entirely, because it was designed in a way to work only with the support of the US presence there, and particularly the presence of US contractors. So I think the way it's been structured, so to answer your question, I think, the possibility of a coalition of the willing can only be functioning an ISAF 2.0 if the US is present there. As part of that coalition. That's number one. Second, that's only part of the story, because I think we also need to look at what might be the diplomatic and political dimensions of that, where you need to involve the neighbors. Now, until now, the US approach, for obvious reasons, has only been with and through Pakistan. It has not included Iran. And for its own reasons, there's been limited cooperation, certainly under this new circumstances, with Russia, or even with some of the Central Asian states. There has been, but not with Russia, and certainly not with China. And it's very difficult to think of any kind of arrangement which could sort of fill that vacuum and stabilize Afghanistan without the neighbors being involved. And I think that's a very important element. Now, One thing I will throw out there, which is an unknown, because it hasn't shown any sort of inclination in that direction, is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The SCO actually has a very strong counterterrorism mandate, at least in theory. They've also been carrying out some exercises. And again, obviously China is a key player there, then Russia, then perhaps countries like India and others. Whether they want to step up and take this on as a challenge remains to be seen, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
Sandhya, your thoughts on that? Is there someone capable of filling the bag?
Sure. So before I answer, if there is someone who can solve this problem or help out, I think it's important to know we're looking at another round of state collapse. We saw, a state collapse on August 15th. The U.S.-backed Afghan state collapsed. Its military collapsed. Its bureaucratic structure collapsed. Its political elites fled the country. I think we might see another collapse over the next 6 months, maybe 12 months, a little bit down the road. The Taliban are really struggling to govern the country. They have not been able to revive, any, or maybe any is a stretch, but much of the bureaucratic machinery of the country has not been revived. We are looking at a crisis of hunger. There's going to be very serious food security problem in the country. There are lots of unemployed people. The Afghan military had a strength of around 300,000. All of those people are unemployed. A lot of government bureaucrats are unemployed. There's mass unemployment. Lots of people who know how to use guns, are not getting paid. So it's a real crisis that is brewing in that country. And I just don't see any international actor having much interest in extending a helping hand to the Taliban. And that's for the most part because of the Taliban's behavior. They remain intransigent in most of their positions. They refuse to create a government structure which is inclusive. They've not included women. They've also excluded most ethnic groups, most non-Pashtun ethnic groups. They have not given them any meaningful representation. So the Taliban are not making it easy for the international community to engage with them. So obviously, this is a global collective action problem, and the only country that can solve it is the United States. But I see no appetite, absolutely no appetite in the Biden administration for now. There is no Afghan policy of this administration in the month of October at least, and we'll see what happens in the next few months. There is an interest in an over-the-horizon counterterrorism approach. Working out ways to monitor some of these terror groups in Afghanistan and neutralizing them should threats begin to metastasize. But I'm not sure the administration will be able to broker a posture for that. There are no U.S. military bases proximate to or in the neighborhood of Afghanistan. So the U.S. is not interested. The Chinese and the Russians, initially I thought that they would take more of a lead, but the Chinese have also become more cautious over the last few months. I think they're not seeing the kind of action that they expected from the Taliban after the Taliban assumed power. Like the Chinese have major terrorism concerns, especially about some of these Uyghur jihadists in the country. And the Taliban are not delivering on some of their concerns. So for now, the Chinese have promised to pledge $15 million in humanitarian aid. And just by way of comparison, Al-Qaeda was paying the Taliban $20 million before 9/11, each year. So Chinese are giving essentially effectively nothing. The Russians have worked more closely with Pakistan, appear to be more supportive of the Taliban this time compared to the last time the Taliban were in power. But even they are dithering on this question of diplomatic recognition and extending meaningful economic support. So this Afghanistan remains a global bad, and major powers just don't seem interested enough to do much about it.
Ahmad, I'm curious if you think, from your perspective in Southeast Asia, is there a country in the region, whether it's China or Japan or others, that might be able to play sort of a coordinating role if the United States really isn't interested? And I think most would agree that the Biden administration has no real appetite for Afghanistan, certainly not in a major way. Is there another country that might be able to, if not fill the vacuum, at least step forward and say, I want to play a role in trying to bring some collective action together so that we can try, not just militarily, but as was pointed out, diplomatically, economically, to try and prevent the worst from happening?
Thank you, Barry. I would say the best way forward at the moment is to look at or to utilize or leverage on the smart power. We have seen the application of the hard power in the past 20 years by the United States and Afghanistan. It doesn't work. It has actually backfired the United States, and it actually doesn't solve the problem. I read the book written by the former Taliban's ambassador to Pakistan, Abdul Salam Zaif, who wrote that United States is a country who has so much power, and he want to kill mosquitoes with a sledgehammer because he used the so much hard power and not the soft power. So I believe that the smart power, that is a combination between political solution, diplomacy, negotiation, and military power, military solution. So the balance between the two, meaning that the use of military solution whenever it is appropriate, and the need to use soft power, negotiation, diplomacy, because Taliban is also rational in that sense. They have learned so much in the past 20 years, I would say. They have learned a bitter lesson in the past 20 years, and plus during its administration from 1996 to 2001. And now, you know, they say that we are willing to negotiate, and they negotiated with the United States. And they promised some kind of reform, even though, as I said, that a lot of people are suspicious with what their commitment. But I believe that if we are going to use hard power to deal with Taliban, that is going to produce that would be counterproductive. That would be a backfire. That would be a blowback. We have seen this thing happen before, and I believe that the combination between political solution, diplomacy, and military solution would be better. It is not about the country. The country may play, I mean, the neighboring country may play a role, Qatar may play the role, but what type of approach that we are using in dealing with them? Thank you.
Well, you know, I think as everyone here has pointed out so astutely, in some ways, the United States, the Biden administration, has really made that conclusion as well, that hard power didn't work. 20 years later, after 9/11, the United States really didn't achieve the aims that it set out to do, certainly in a sustained way, or a way that was sustainable. But I think, my takeaway from this terrific conversation is that, on the one hand, the United States made the decision this isn't working anymore. In fact, it's probably leading to diminishing returns. But there really isn't anything in its place yet. There isn't a diplomatic effort of a global nature. There isn't the economic effort to replace that hard power with, as Ahmad said, soft power. And so I think that's the takeaway we can all have, which is that Afghanistan is going to be a problem. There's very little doubt about that. No one can predict exactly how it will play out, but there will be spillover effects of just simply having this ungoverned space, which history has shown leads to bad things. I want to thank all of you for joining today, and I want to thank the Sufan Center for this this event. I think I hope everybody's wrong, and all of this doesn't happen. But I do think that I think we all hope that a whole host of governments will come together and really start to think much harder about what is our strategy for what comes next in Afghanistan, because it's not just about Afghanistan. It's about the whole region and really the whole world community. So thanks again to all the panelists for joining us today, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brian.